Hi, I decided to do a video article mostly because I am more comfortable speaking than I am writing. My writing is, without an editor, is very sketchy at best, to say the least. But I figured I have the video recording equipment. Why not do a video instead? So here I am. I'm going to do a video for the deck that I'll play in Dallas. This is the Azorius Aggro is what they're calling it. It's basically white weenie with a blue splash, like a very light blue splash, so you have a little bit more um, interaction with the current metagame being like Esper control and things like Turbo Fog and the Nexus decks and stuff like that. You just like need counter magic or discard or something like that. You can't just like interact with creature combat and things like Conclave Tribunal and Deputy Detention. So anyway, let's get into the meat and the bones of this deck. Basically, the way that this deck's built is it's playing a low land count, 20 lands, but you kind of have extra lands in this card, which is Legion's Landing. If you get this to flip, the backside of it is Adanto the First Fort. So it kind of counts as part of a land if you build your deck correctly. In order to do that, we play a very high density of 1 mana cost creatures. So 18 of 18 1-drops to be exact. I'm playing a little bit different 2-drop spot. Basically, can't really figure out which one I like better between Adanto Vanguard and Tithe Taker. Tithe Taker gives you a little more protection on your turn, so things like Turbo Fog can have maybe making the fog costs 3 or the Settle the Wreckage costs 4, kind of like taxes them on their turn. They can't use their mana as much as they would like, and then also just maybe stall out for 1 turn, which can be pretty key in those matchups. And then Adanto Vanguard is better against things like Kaya's Wrath, or it's also just a better creature in combat. So expecting a little bit more Sultai than Turbo Fog, so I'm going with a 3-2 split of Adanto Vanguard versus Tithe Taker. My threes, the ones that are kind of locked in, are the Banalish Marshals and History of Benalia. Both of them are very powerful effects. History is just an insane card and one of the main reasons to play a deck like this. Same with like Legion's Landing. Both of these cards play very well just in generating massive amounts of card advantage. Legion's Landing making more tokens over time, and then utilizing like the lords to make them bigger. And then History of Benalia is 2 creatures plus a lord. We used to call it kind of like a Gideon Jura, like a fixed Gideon, where you 0 to make a token, 0 to make a token, then you make an emblem, and then that was kind of like how Gideon kind of worked anyway. So this is just kind of like Gideon over 3 turns. And then my kind of like flex spots, as you will. I'm playing 1 Deputy of Attention main. This is kind of to hedge against a lot of different decks. The Turbo Fog decks, they have problematic permanents that you do want to get rid of, such as like Wilderness Reclamation or Search for Escanta. And then also for the mirror match, when you're playing against History of Benalia, Deputy Detention is one of the best ways to get rid of it. I also think it's like pretty great in game 1, just in general. And then Unbreakable Formation is insane in all the creature matchups. Acting as another lord, getting all your creatures +1/+1 counters, and then getting an indestructible vigilant attack is really great. And then also it's flexible in the fact that it can like stop Gates Ablaze or Kaya's Wrath. So it's just like a pretty great card. I've seen a lot of lists shifting to 2 of these. I haven't really enjoyed having 2 of them just because like the games that you draw 2 of them, your hands can be kind of clunky, and you only really need 1 of these effects. But if you do have 2 of them, you will draw it more often, and you'll have like the more chance to have like 1 of these effects in each game. Finally, Conclave Tribunal. This is the hardest part, where I kind of want 4 Conclave Tribunal, but I've been really liking Deputy Detention, so I did do 3. I can see arguments for playing a 4th Conclave Tribunal over a Deputy Detention, but currently I have the Deputy Detention in the main. And then finally, this card, I see a lot of people kind of like try to trim on this card or anything like that. This card is busted. It is Venerated Loxodon. Not only does our Legion's Landing want us to play a ton of 1-drops, but so does Venerated Loxodon, so they kind of work hand in hand. You just build up these huge board states, and when your opponents get better creatures over the course of the game, usually a white weenie deck will kind of fizzle out and just kind of like die off. But our creatures actually get so big because we just have 9 lords inside of our deck, and so that's just usually our game plan: is hit them fast early, and then kind of like build up this huge creature base and then attack them like a big alpha strike to win the game at the end. Sometimes it's a little easier than that, but that's just like the harder like creature mirrors type of thing. The sideboard we'll go over. We have 3 Baffling Ends, 3 Tocatli Honor Guards, 3 Ajani Adversary of Tyrant, 2 Disdainful Strokes, 3 Negate, and 1 extra Deputy Detention to fill out the, so I have 2 in the 75. Just going over these quickly, Baffling End's pretty simple. Small creatures, just exiles them. Same with the new X creature, because it costs green, blue, and X Hydroid Crisis. That does have a converted mana cost of 2 on the battlefield, so it just like gets rid of it right away. Tocatli Honor Guard is great against any of the Golgari decks, whether they're just regular Golgari, whether they're splashing blue or whatever. Also, people were playing the new Birthing Pod creature, which name escapes me right now, but it's usually great against that deck because they have a lot of come into play abilities. Ajani is just great at in conjunction with Tocatli Honor Guard. It's -2, brings it back, but also this makes your creatures out of range for things like Find Finality, and then also makes it so that your creatures are bigger than theirs on the battlefield as well. And over time, if you can work to that emblem, a lot of the times the emblem is usually a win. Not always, but most of the time. Disdainful Stroke and Negate are pretty self-explanatory. They're counterspells that can target different threats, but for the most part, they're kind of like our interaction that stops basically getting our creatures off the board or deploying a creature that will like kind of make our creatures irrelevant. And then finally, Deputy Detention is another catch-all that's good in the tokens matchups. So things like History of Benalia or Hero Precinct 1, those type of things. Finally, let's go over some of the boarding strategies. So here, I'm going to go over them, and then also below the video on my website, if you're watching this on YouTube, the website is the Modular Manifesto .wordpress.com. And I will have my deck list posted there, and then also the sideboard strategy guide underneath there. So if you like it in text form, you can watch it there. If you'd rather hear me talk about why I like these cards in the matchup, that'll be on here. So anyway, let's get started. So versus Sultai, I like boarding out these Hunted Witnesses. I like boarding out this Unbreakable formation. I like boarding out Deputy Detention, the Tribunals, and 1 Dauntless Bodyguard, and all of these Sky Marcher Aspirants. Or not Sky Marcher Aspirant, sorry. All the Tithe Takers. Sorry, can't even read my own handwriting here. And then coming in those spots are, well, this whole first row here, and the extra Disdainful Strokes here. So basically why we're making this swap is, like I said earlier, Conclave Tribunal, while being a very good card and very mana efficient, Baffling End actually gets the majority of the creatures that you want to get, including Hydroid Crisis. So it's just a little swap, and then also if they have a way to kill the Conclave Tribunal, they don't get back their their 1/3 creature that the name escapes me that gains life whenever they explore. Wildgrowth Walker, and then Tocatli Honor Guard also is against the Wildgrowth Walker Explore package, but also like things like Ravenous Chupacabra, stuff like that. And then finally, well, I shouldn't say finally, Ajani works once again well with Tocatli Honor Guard, but for bringing it back, keeping it always in play. But it also makes it so that Find Finality doesn't take out something like Venerated Loxodon. It's very easy to make this creature to have 5 power, but it's also pretty easy once you get Ajani going to make something like Benalish Marshal and Snubborn Century into 5 power. I am aware of the Tocatli Honor Guard Venerated Loxodon like non-bow, but having a 4/4 creature for essentially free, because you're going to be tapping creatures that you're most likely not attacking with, is a pretty big bonus. And if you don't have Tocatli Honor Guard in play, obviously the bonus is just outstanding. Something in a note here is that Dauntless Bodyguard does work when Tocatli Honor Guard is on the battlefield. It says as it enters the battlefield and not like when it enters the battlefield. So you will get to choose somebody with your Tocatli Honor Guard in play, and usually it's the Tocatli Honor Guard to protect it against like Cast Down or Assassin's Trophy. And then the final card is Disdainful Stroke. I've been kind of waffling on how many I'm supposed to play and whether or not it's supposed to be Disdainful Stroke or Negate. Mostly, I wanted it in there against Find Finality. The other thing you can tag with it is like something like Vivian Reed, which is like a very good source of card advantage. But what really put Disdainful Stroke over the top of Negate is that they started playing Hostage Taker, and while Takali Arneguard also protects against Hostage Taker, it just gives me enough targets to allow Disdainful Stroke to be a good enough card to put into the side or in the sideboarded games. If they didn't have something like that, I might not play 2 Disdainful Strokes. Maybe I'll just play 1. Keep in something like this Dauntless Bodyguard or something like that. But as it stands right now, if they're going to play Hostage Taker, I'm going to play Disdainful Stroke as well. All right. Obviously, I guess I should go over some of the things that I boarded out. Hunted Witness is just your worst 1-drop in this. If I had 4 Hunted Witness, they would normally go out. Skymarcher Aspirant is your second best 1-drop in this. It probably goes something like Legion's Landing, Skymarcher, Snubhorn Sentry, Dauntless Bodyguard, and then finally Hunted Witness for this matchup. So you want to board out a certain amount of 1s. You can board out a maximum of 4 in this deck and still kind of function as a Legion's Landing deck. So these are the 4 that I've chosen. Tithe Taker is not particularly great in combat. It's not really stopping them from playing any spells on your turn. So Tithe Taker kind of gets the X here. Deputy Detention just has really bad synergies with Takali Arneguard, and also it's not super great as like most of the threats that you want to get with this you can get with Baffling Net anyway. An Unbreakable Formation, Find Finality is their sweeper, so the -1 or the -4/-4 just kind of still gets your creatures anyway. Unbreakable Formation is not going to save you from that, and while it does give you the like Alpha Strike big creature turn, the I think the downside of the like kind of like how the games play out, you don't really need Unbreakable Formation. The downside is just like it gets stuck in your hand when you'd rather have a creature or one of these spells. So let's go ahead and reset the deck to what it was previously and go over the next matchup. The next matchup is going to be Esper Control. So, dang it. So with Esper Control, we're boarding out 2 of the Benalish Marshals. We're going to go ahead and board out 1 of the Conclave Tribunals. We're going to board out the Unbreakable Formation. We're going to board out Deputy of Detention. And finally, 2 Skymarcher Aspirant. In this matchup, we're going to board in all of the blue cards and 2 Ajani. And that's it. So, let's get these over here so we can kind of talk about what's going on here. So, coming in is pretty simple, right? Negate, Disdainful Stroke, both counter Kaya's Wrath. They all counter Teferi. They all counter, basically all of their sweepers, all of their interaction. Disdainful Stroke doesn't counter like something like Mortify, Cast Down, Moment of Craving, or anything like that. But most of the time, you're not really negating those targets anyway. Disdainful Stroke does, however, counter things like Hostage Taker or Lyra if they were to board them in. Some people are also boarding in the 4-mana 3/4 Basilica Bellhaunt. And so like Disdainful Stroke has some warrant there too, because that card is usually pretty good, as once the Basilica Bellhaunt can come down, you're protecting something like a Loxodon or a Ajani as like your last card in hand. Ajani is just pretty great as its -2 ability is very relevant, and its +1 ability is very relevant. So I like both of those. And then as for the things that are coming out, Skymarcher Aspirant is probably your worst 1-drop in this matchup, because the 2/1 body is not a huge benefit when you have something like Hunted Witness, which can make more creatures when it gets Kaya's Wrath. Legion's Landing, if it ever flips, is just great. Snubhorn Sentry can get around cards like Cry of Carnarium, and Dauntless Bodyguard protects your other threats from Kaya's Wrath. Going to our 2-drops, Tithe Taker is pretty great at both forcing through something like History of Benalia, making Absorb cost 1 more mana, but it is also a creature that when it dies, it does make a 1/1 flying creature, so it like gives you something to do with your lords post-combat or post-Wrath. Adanto Vanguard is obviously excellent against Wrath. Both of these cards are bad against Cry of Carnarium, but that's just kind of how it is. Benalish Marshal just costs a little too much mana. and it doesn't have the same upside as Johnny, but you still want them because you want something to pump these Hunted Witnesses and these Tide Taker tokens, but you don't want to get flooded on Banalish Marshals. You don't want to cast 3/3s for 3. History of Benalia is a card that is one of the best cards in this matchup if you leverage it correctly. Basically, you want to cast this the turn after they Kaya's Wrath, or if you have Kaya's Wrath kind of in check, then you can cast these as well. You never or if you can make a token the turn after it comes into play, like you can play a History of Benalia, maybe have like your board be like Hunted Witness, Tide Taker, History of Benalia, and you're like, well, if you Kaya's Wrath this turn, I get 2 tokens to attack you with plus a History of Benalia token. That's usually okay. So it's just like one of the cards that if you leverage correctly is very powerful in this matchup. You don't want to get rid of all your removal in this matchup. I could see an argument for keeping in 3 Conclave Tribunals because they do bring in things like Lyra. But once again, you don't want to get too many interactive spells in this matchup. You definitely want a lot of power. So I have decided to board out the down to 2 Conclave Tribunals and then play things like Disdainful Stroke instead. But if you're finding that you're losing to Lyras or maybe they're just boarding down a ton of creatures, then keeping Conclave Tribunal in the deck is something you can definitely do. If you do that, I would probably board out maybe the last Sky Marcher Aspirant in that aspect. And then finally, Venerate Loxodon, while it may not look great here because they do kill most of your creatures, it's just a cheap threat when you can set up for like a 2-turn lethal. So you can like build up these boards where you have a lot of these tokens from like Tide Taker, Hunted Witness, Legion's Landing, stuff like that. You can play this for like 3 mana while holding open a Negator and a Disdainful Stroke, and then you're like, next turn I'm going to attack you for 8, and most likely that's their entire life total. All right, so the next matchup on the list here, sort this by convert mana cost. The next one on the matchup here is Mono Red. I know that one of you had asked me how I feel about the Mono Red matchup, so I kind of addressed that here. I'll also address it in the comments where you commented. I actually like the Mono Red matchup a lot. Basically, one of the only ways they can beat you is if your hand's a little clunky or if they get like multiple Goblin Chain Whirlers. So you just gotta like kind of play in a way that you're not gonna end up losing to Goblin Chain Whirler. Your cards get better as the game goes on, so don't be afraid to trade resources early on. Yeah, I mean that's just basically kind of how it works. For sideboarding purposes, let's go ahead and do that. Adanto Vanguard is one of the weaker cards in the matchup. It has 1 toughness. They're basically, when you block with it, it has to trade because you don't want to pay 4 life over and over again. It is nice because it can attack into a Goblin Chain Whirler. So if you do win the die roll in game 1, you can definitely just like keep attacking with it because you're probably not going to block with it. And probably don't be too aggressive in staving it either. Like I said, trading resources is fine. Your cards are usually better than theirs as long as they don't have Experimental Frenzy. And if they do, hopefully you can Tribunal it or Deputy Detention it or something like that to get it out of the way. The next one is Unbreakable Formation. This one might sound counterintuitive, but it just costs too much mana, to be honest. Like, you can, it's like good against their creatures, but your creatures are already bigger, and then it's good against Goblin Chain Whirler, but are you realistically holding up 3 mana on the turn that they're going to cast Goblin Chain Whirler? And the answer is usually not. And then the 3 Sky Marcher Aspirants. This is to insulate us against against Goblin Chain Whirler. Now, if you notice, most of our 1-drops are pretty good against Goblin Chain Whirler. Hunted Witness makes us another token. Dauntless Bodyguard can protect maybe like this Vampire token. Legion's Landing is mostly just key because if you ever flip it, you can always chump block something like a Goblin Chain Whirler, or you can just make these huge battlefields that they can't deal with. And then finally, I'm going to board out the last Hunted Witness. While I did just say that Hunted Witness is good against Goblin Chain Whirler, it doesn't match up with their creatures super well. So just boarding that out for because it's just kind of the weakest 1-drop and out of the rest of the ones that are left. Anyway, you could also, if you wanted to, you could board out Dauntless Bodyguard over this Hunted Witness. That's like kind of just like how you feel and like how you play, I guess. I actually like Dauntless Bodyguard protecting things like Deputy Detention or Marshal. That's the reason I keep it in. All right. As for sideboarding, a Johnny is just great. It puts plus counters on your creatures, which can you're already trying to outsize their creatures. That's usually how you win. But also just bringing back your 2-drops that are impactful, or your 1-drops that are impactful, like Snubhorn Sentry is just bigger than a lot of their creatures. So bringing that back is great. Bringing back Tide Taker to like jump block and make another flying creature is also pretty great. It also works pretty great in conjunction with Takatli Honor Guard, which on the play you're going to board in 2 of these. Once again, that's for Goblin Chainwhirler, it's for Viashino Pyromancer. It's just a pretty decent card in general. And then finally, when you're on the draw, you're going to board in. Finally, you're going to board in the 3 Baffling Ends. Baffling End, you're just going to try to hit Goblin Chainwhirlers with them if you can. The rest of their creatures are not super impactful. And then you also have Conclave Tribunal and Deputy Detention. Once again, this is a Nambo, Takatli Honor Guard and Deputy Detention, but it'll come up very rarely in testing. And actually, on the draw, when you're on the draw, you board out the last Deputy Detention and you board in the last Takatli Honor Guard, and that's once again to insulate you against Goblin Chainwhirler. Chainwhirler, if you go like 1-drop and then you go Takatli Honor Guard, they can't kill your 1-drop by playing Chainwhirler on their 3, right? So that's like why you want the extra one on the draw, on the draw, because you're going to be behind a land, and when you're on the play, it's less needed here, where this one could get you to clear their battlefield of something like Goblin Chainwhirlers. But you can also get to Banalish Marshal on your 3, which makes their Goblin Chainwhirler bad, or maybe even Loxidoning some of the X1s to insulate you against Goblin Chainwhirler. So yeah, that's the red matchup in a nutshell. Basically, get wide, get your creatures that are better than their creatures, and then just punish them from there on out. All right, let's go ahead and sort these again. Next matchup is Mono Blue Aggro. I'm going to go over the next 2 pretty quickly because I think Mono Blue Aggro is just an insanely great matchup. Not going to talk about it too much. Your creatures are just better than their creatures. They come down at about the same rate. They have one good card, or essentially 2 good cards, I guess. The best card is the Curious Obsession, and the next best card is Tempest Djinn, and those are the only cards that really matter. So when I go to sideboarding, I board out these Adanto Vanguards because, once again, they're kind of a liability, and then the Unbreakable Formation. Unbreakable Formation is kind of cool. It's a Lord, but they do have Spell Pierce and things like that, so you just kind of want to, insulate yourself against Spell Pierce, but then also you don't really need to make your creatures bigger than theirs. They start that way. And then you board in Baffling End and Deputy Detention, just all your extra removal. So basically, get your creatures on the battlefield, start attacking, try not to get caught by Merfolk Trickster or Fairy Trickery, or what is that called? The 1/2 that gives, when it comes into play, it gives a target creature -2/-0. Try not to get caught on those. Those both cost 2. So, I mean, if you can choose between attacking on turn 2 or flipping Legion's Landing on turn 3, flipping Legion's Landing on turn 3 will cause them to play the Merfolk Trickster. If they have it, and if they don't, you flip your landing, and it costs you maybe a damage or 2, and that's usually fine. And then, unsurprisingly, the mirror is very similar. Instead of Unbreakable Formation, you board out Tide Taker. So 1 Tide Taker. You want to board out 2. This is kind of a concession I made when I was building the deck. So having 5 2-drops means that I can't board out all of them unless I played 4 Baffling Ends, and I'd rather have the Takatli Honor Guard. So it means that you have 1 awkward 2-drop, and that's fine. But once again, Deputy Detention is great against the History Mirror, and then Baffling End gets almost every single creature in the matchup except for Venerated Loxodon, but then you have 5 removal spells against Loxodon. So yeah, this is just kind of how the mirror goes. The mirror is about getting on the board first, getting wide, and then getting big. So make sure that you use your deputies, make sure that you use your Conclave Tribunals and Baffling Ends correctly. Don't just throw them at things. Make sure that you have a very good reason for playing them. Usually that reason is Banalish Marshal or History Benalia, in the case of Deputy Detention. But remember that if you Conclave Tribunal and History Benalia, they can come back when they Conclave Tribunal your Conclave Tribunal, or Deputy Detention your Conclave Tribunal. So just make sure that you're paying attention to that type of things. Also, if your opponent just like has a great baffling end draw, remember that you can deputy detention the baffling ends and get a bunch of 3/3s. So that's just something to keep in mind there. So yeah. Finally, let's go to Bant Nexus. So let's go ahead and put this back to normal. Really quick here. Oops. There we go. All right. So Bant Nexus, we want out all the Hunted Witnesses. It is kind of just our least efficient creature, and they don't particularly play Wrath of Gods ever. So just like the 1/1 token doesn't really matter. Board out 1 Snubhorn Sentry, and then finally 2 Loxodons. Loxodon in this matchup is just a little slow. For the most part, you just want to attack, 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 attack. So taking a turn off to tap your venerated or tap your creatures for venerated Loxodon just doesn't really work that well. And then you want all of your interaction blue cards out of the sideboard. This matchup, I will say, sometimes the mana gets a little sketchy, but if you have 1 blue, you should be able to win the game. We used to have an island in the sideboard. It didn't really work out because it's kind of super awkward with Benalish Marshall, and you still want Benalish Marshall in this matchup. If you do want to feel safe and you do want to play that extra island, I don't know exactly what you'd cut from the sideboard. Maybe this Deputy of Detention, but I would maybe cut up Benalish Marshall as the last card for the island in this matchup. But this matchup is super simple, at least. You're going to go ahead and you're just going to build a huge battlefield. They usually can't punish you. Some of them have started playing Settle the Wreckage. That's kind of why Tide Taker's there, so be aware of that. But a lot of the times it's just fog and spells. So just attack them and then hold up Disdainful Stroke or Negate for key spells. Something like maybe like Wilderness Reclamation, which is why we bring in the extra Deputy and we have the Conclave still in the deck. One of the cards that you can maybe also bring out is Unbreakable Formation, if you want to keep in one of these as well. But I've kind of ended up liking this card in that matchup just because it's a Lord that you can cast for 3 while holding open one of these, which is kind of nice. So yeah, the matchup is pretty good. As long as you remember that to keep Settle the Wreckage in mind, and then also keep in mind that they could be boarding in creatures, which is kind of like one of the reasons for the Disdainful Stroke, and then also we luckily also already bring in the O-Ring effects anyway. Blue-Red Drakes I probably should have done while I was doing the other great matchups of the 50-50 mirror match, but let's go ahead and do that now. Matchup's pretty easy, just because, once again, they don't have a lot of ways to stop you. While their creatures are technically bigger than ours, they cost so much more and they don't impact the boards much. That could change if they start playing things like Mermaid Mystic again, but for right now, the matchup's just great. So what I like to board in this matchup is I like to board in 2 negates. They usually have something like a Fiery Cannonade to play against us, or just like more burn spells to kill our creatures. And then 1 Baffling End is something I like to bring in as well. You can just kind of snag a Drake. They kind of have to play one. I don't like the Deputy Detention because it kind of gives the Drake back, but the other thing is I'm not super sold on Baffling End. I could see it being another negate as well, just because a lot of people have been playing Enigma Drake, but they don't really play, and they also play, what's it called, Pterodon, the 1-drop. But the last creature is usually Crackwing Drake, and Baffling End doesn't get Crackwing Drake, but usually Crackwing Drake's a little too slow. But for the most part, I feel like if I don't get Fiery Cannonaded to a good effect, then you win this game pretty easily. So which is why I board in the 2 negates. Skymarcher Aspirant is just our worst creature because, like I said, you don't want to get hit by Fiery Cannonade. This card gets hit by Fiery Cannonade pretty well. It also gets shocked pretty well, which is another way that they can kind of fight you. And let's see, 2 more matchups left to go over. So let's go ahead and do that. So the last one, or the second to last one is Gates without Fog. So this is going to be your Nexus, Hydrate, Krasis decks. I believe Drake Sasser got 4th place in the Classic with this deck. So that's kind of the list I went off of for the sideboard guide if you're looking at that. So I don't like 2 of the Tide Takers. They don't really interact on your turn. They're basically just a ramp deck. And the tokens, while nice, don't really impact the board too much. I like boarding out 1 Banalish Marshal, 1 Snubhorn Sentry, and 2 Sky Marcher Aspirant. It could be 3 Sky Marcher Aspirants over the Snubhorn Sentry. I'm kind of like debating which one is worse. That's why I kind of like decided to do one or two of each of them. And then for the cards that you're going to bring in is all these blue cards once again. So similar to the last matchup, or the Bant Nexus matchup, they do have problematic permanents. So they do have things like Hydroid Krasis, and they also have like the Wild Growth or Wilderness Reclamation / Nexus combo. So you want to like make sure you break that up. But they also are going to bring in a lot of creatures, and those creatures are usually the Angel and sometimes the Ram. So you just want to make sure that you have ways to kill those creatures. So Deputy Detention and Conclave Tribunal are both great ways to do that. And then the negates insulate you against something like Gates Ablaze. It is a little awkward that not all of our blue counter magic stops their sweepers, because they usually only play Gates Ablaze as their sweeper. But you do have 3 negates for that, and then you also have like things like Indomitable Vanguard and stuff like that. And then Disdainful Stroke is pretty nice because it does stop Gateway Angel, which is like one of the ways they can come back in the game. Usually how the game plays out is you get on the board pretty quickly, you end up having to like suicide attack one of your creatures into like a ram. Hopefully you just like counter their Gates Ablaze, and then that's like kind of the choking point is like if they have an Angel and you don't have a Disdainful Stroke, the game gets a lot tougher because they gain something like 10 life. Hopefully your board is like pretty big for that. Also, that kind of like brings me to the point where this is why we don't cut Unbreakable Formation, because they are a red-based removal, and it kind of scales super high. So you just want like essentially 4 negates, and this is just kind of our 4th negate. But yeah, so Disdainful Stroke pretty great in this matchup as well, which is I really like the card right now. So I'm a huge fan of Disdainful Stroke currently. If you notice that they're playing all the Rams and all of the Hydroid Krasis post sideboard, and maybe even something else that you can Baffling End, I wouldn't argue with boarding in Baffling End either. Currently, I'm not doing it, but it could see like maybe 1 or 2 of those cards. But I'm not really sure what you cut at that point. Maybe a Deputy Detention, but I like Deputy the versatility of Deputy is just great. And then finally, this is probably our worst matchup of the decks that get played. And this is Esper Midrange. Esper Midrange is like pretty great against this deck because their creatures outsize you pretty quickly. They all have like pretty big value, but also Hero Precinct 1 just makes a huge roadblock for your creatures to get through. And while eventually you'll get through all those creatures, by that time they're casting something like a Lyra or a Hostage Taker or a Basilica Bellhaunt or something like that, and it just like the combination of all of that just kind of stalls the deck out. And like if I could never face this deck, that would be the greatest thing ever, because usually I face it once per tournament and usually it just trounces this deck. But what I found is the most effective way to beat them is to try to stay low to the ground and have just a little bit of interaction. So as you've seen, I didn't actually board that much in. I boarded in these 2 Disdainful Strokes and this Deputy Detention. The reason is that you don't want to get into a longer game with them. Baffling End only really hits the hero, and it only really hits the Thief of Sanities. I assume that they will board out the Thief of Sanities. They don't really usually have more than just like 1 Ritual of Soot, maybe 2, maybe a Kaya's Wrath in the board. Disdainful Stroke also gets that. This is one of the matchups where I wish I had 3 or 4 Disdainful Strokes for, but unfortunately the other matchups don't warrant it. You're not really bringing anything super impactful back with Johnny Adversary Tyrants, and you're also not really plussing with it, and you don't board out your other lords. So I don't really board that in there. Once again, the negates, because they don't have a lot of sweepers, it's just kind of like not a thing I want to do. Tecatli Underguard is a card I messed around with like back and forth, but I think your busted Loxodon draws are one of the best ways to beat that deck. So boarding in a card like Tecatli Underguard just doesn't do it for me, because I'd rather have the Loxodon and the Deputy Detention than the Tecatli Underguard. But on paper it seems great because it could stop Hostage Taker, it could stop Basilica Bellhaunt, it can stop stuff like that. But it's like I would rather just get a big board and get wide and get as big a creatures as possible with my Venerated Loxodon, and then do something like Deputy all their tokens from their Hero Precinct 1, and then get in with a huge attack. I think that's going to be the way that you win most of the time. You have the max amount of ways to kill Lyra, or like Seraph or anything like that. So like Seraph of Sanctum is like a great way to stop this deck as well, because you have to attack into a 4/3, which usually trades with one of your creatures, and then it has 2 blockers behind it. So the deck is just like a pile of 2-for-1s, and if you can't kill them early, you're probably not going to kill them, and that's just kind of why I like Disdainful Stroke and Deputy Detention in that matchup, and like that's it. I don't want to slow the deck down anymore by putting in more negates, Unbreakable Formation, anything like that. So if you find another way to board for Esper mid-range and you definitely like that strategy, let me know. I'm all ears for that for sure. But yeah, so this is the list that I am planning on bringing to SEG Dallas this weekend. Once again, my website, which is themodularmanifesto.wordpress.com. Let me put that up here real quick. It should be below you in the title. So let's see. Wow. modularmanifesto.wordpress.com. So if you go there, you can get a text version of this sideboard guide, and then also a text version of this deck. And once again, I'm pretty sold at playing this exact 75. If I make a change, it's going to be just like 1 or 2, maybe like a Sky Marcher over a Hunted Witness or something like that. Doesn't change the deck too much. But yeah, so anyway, thank you all for watching. Let me know if you like this format better than text. I personally like it better because I'm just not great at writing, and I don't have an editor, so that does that for me. And anyway, once again, thank you all for watching. If you do, come down to Dallas, definitely say hi or whatever. That'd be great. And otherwise, I should be streaming more often, just trying to get some more time. So yeah, I hope to stream probably 2 to 3 times a week. So if you like the content here, definitely give me a follow at Conan Hawk on Twitch as well. And I'll see you next time.